All righty, I guess we will go ahead and get started. The clock behind me, I don't know if people can see behind me, probably not, but it's hasn't read the right time for a very long time. Yeah. Okay, so before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to enrich our vibrant community. I'm delighted today to introduce remotely Dr. Fiona Roll. Dr. Roll has a PhD in pathology and molecular medicine and is the Associate Dean, Pedagogical Development and Scholarship at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and a professor in the Department of Biology. Her research focuses on science misinformation, the science of learning, and public communication of science. She's received numerous awards focused on teaching, including the 3M National Teaching Fellowship. Dr. Roll is co-chair of the University of Toronto's TIDE Group, which stands for Toronto Initiative for Diversity and Excellence, through which she gives lectures and workshops on unconscious bias, equity, and diversity. So delighted that she's going to be presenting today on the landscape of bias in academic medicine. So over to you, Dr. Roll.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And so I understand we have folks in the room and also folks online. Part of this presentation is interactive. I would love for you, if you're online, to type into the chat because we're going to do just a couple bias exercises. So I am coming to you from Toronto in Ontario, and I am at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. I'm going to be giving you some slides from two different projects I'm involved in. One is TIDE, Toronto Initiative for Diversity and Excellence. It's a grassroots movement of faculty that are engaged in knowledge translation for evidence-informed practices for inclusion and bias. And then the other is this project about landscapes of bias in different contexts. What do we know about bias in different contexts? What can we actually do to counter bias? And what are some of the intersectional effects? So I'm joining you virtually. I'm here from Toronto, and I just want to acknowledge the land on which I work, live, and play. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. And these objectives are here for your slides that I'll send to you after the session. So we'll be dealing with these terms of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And there's just a few things I wanted to highlight about each of them. For equity, this means fair access. And part of that fair access is really considering the intersectional effects of social identity that can combine and produce very unique barriers as well as opportunities. Diversity is about who is in the space, fair representation of different identity groups at all levels, and inclusion and belonging is really about a seat at the table, that's inclusion, to co-creating the table, which is belonging. A lot of questions about whose table are you sitting at? So I want to get started by this idea of groups and innovation and the importance of diversity to innovation. We know that people from different backgrounds ask very different questions and may approach the same questions in different ways. We know that when experiments fail, diverse groups adopt very different problem-solving strategies. And there are so many case studies through history about lack of diversity and problems with science and medicine and innovation. And I'm not sure if there are any bird watchers in the room, but there's an interesting case study about women scientists and birdsong. So for 150 years, it was thought that only male birds had complex song. And it wasn't until more women were receiving PhDs in animal behavior and designing studies and studying female birds that it was found that actually female birds have incredibly complex song. They just weren't being studied. So I'd like to do another example of innovation and problem solving. So Google owns YouTube, and Google is famous for their development phase testing and their beta phase testing. And a little while ago, they launched a direct upload to YouTube app. So you take your phone, you press one button, you film something, you press another button, it uploads directly. There were no problems in the development phase testing, the beta phase testing, but when it launched worldwide, it failed 5 to 10% of the time. Can anyone guess why? So I encourage you to just think to yourself, to commit to a guess. If you're in the chat, if you're participating on Zoom, type an answer in Zoom. You can type it just to me personally, or you can send it to everyone by changing the little blue toggle bar. And if you don't know, just type "I don't know" so that you type something. Apple blocked it. Great idea, although that's not the right answer. Why didn't this work? Why was it upside down? And again, if you don't know, type "I don't know" so you send something in. I was talking to some high school students about the way science works and groups and innovation, and a whole bunch of them said, Australia. It didn't work for anyone in Australia. And I said, no, that's not why. It had nothing to do with geographic location or with operating system. In this case, it had to do with left-handers. So if you're right-handed, you hold your phone in a different orientation than if you're left-handed. So yeah, Maria, absolutely, you're on the right track about orienting your phone. But it was about handedness. And there were no left-handed folks on the development team or the beta test team. So Google had to come up with a statement saying we don't want to be biased against left-handers, but we created a biased product because of poor diversity on our team. And so this project that we're doing, the landscape of bias in medicine, we're looking at over 100 different types of bias. And there's just a couple examples on the left in red here. And how does this affect the physician experience in academic medicine? How does this affect the patient experience? What type of biases do we see? What are the impacts and what are the outcomes of those biases? Then can we look at science and evidence that has been done for what could we actually do to minimize this bias? What has been shown to actually work? And teaser, unconscious bias training does not work. We cannot train our biases out of us. We have biases because we are human. We have biases because of the way we make decisions. And unconscious bias training is a multi-million-dollar market, especially in the US. But this idea of doing one training session and being done really doesn't work. We need structural and personal change. And this is just some of the examples of some of the impacts of bias that we are looking at. And we're trying to look at what are the intersectional effects? What do they have in common? Are there some key evidence-informed practices we could adopt that could minimize some of these biases? And we'll go through some of these case studies. But there's so many documented biases, differential impacts related to physician experience, so trainee placements, publication acceptance, research funding, systematic thinking errors in terms of diagnosis, workplace discrimination, time. There's a whole bunch of research about requests on folks' time, salary, acceptance of new treatments, and that can align to some of the systematic thinking discrepancies. Patient's perspective, we could look at clinical trial design. We could look at gaps in medical research, disbelief in symptoms by the patient or by others, access to screening, timing of screening, delayed diagnoses, access and outcomes to treatments, avoidance of care, social determinants of health. I'm showing you about 10 to 12% of the various things that we are looking at, but just to give you an idea of some of the items that we're putting on this matrix. So let's start with patterns and representation. So in that YouTube example, there were no left-handers on their team, and it led to a biased product that didn't work for everyone. So let's talk about who's in the space and who's in the room. So this is Canadian data. And I just want to make a note here. You see the word female and male on the screen. Female and male usually used to describe sex, not gender. I'm using the words that are in the studies that we're citing. And so sometimes you're going to see man, woman, sometimes you're going to see female, male. It is not as simplistic as that, but I'm just using the words in these studies. So this is Canadian data. Now, in the mid-1980s, we reached parity for females and males getting undergrad degrees. It was similar for grad school, and it reached parity for grad school in the year 2000. What about for med school? So med school parity for MDs, parity was reached in 1995, and now there's more women than men enrolled in med schools in Canada. So let's follow that out over time. What does that look like over time? So this is following out folks who go to graduate school, get PhDs, and then continue on in academia, assistant, associate, and full professor. And this is data from EU, Canada, and the USA. It all tracks very similarly. So there's more females than males getting bachelors, the same for PhD, but then many fewer females reach full professor. And some folks will say, well, it takes time for changes to make their way through the system. We have to be patient. It takes time. And yes, that's true. It does take time. But the data here is 2 decades after graduate enrollment similarity, 7 years after graduate enrollment parity. So let's jump ahead by 10 years and see how the data has changed. So jump ahead by 10 years, and you can see that the data hasn't changed significantly. And this is 30 years after graduate enrollment similarity. We could also look at data for MDs who stay in academic medicine. And you can see it's very similar. Yeah, and absolutely, the comment in the chat, this is the pipeline argument from years ago. It's not just about a pipeline or a leaky pipeline. Okay. And Dean of Medicine, and again, this is Canadian data here. So this is about representation, who's in the room, and then who is in leadership. Does representation lead to equity and inclusion, just having folks in the room? So I just want to give a little bit of background on bias and race before we get into some case studies. So unconscious bias, also termed implicit bias, this is something that we have because we're human, it's how our brains work. These are attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, decisions in an unconscious manner. They could be favorable or unfavorable. They act very, very quickly. And it can be influenced by our background, cultural environment, and our personal experiences. We're going to look at some cases on racial bias. And I just want to go back to definitions of race. So National Institute of Health defines race as a concept used to group people that share a set of visible characteristics such as skin color, facial features, and visible characteristics are influenced by genes, and race is related to ancestral background. But the vast majority of genetic variation exists within racial groups, not between them. But race, folks look different based on genetics. The race construct is a social construct. The genes that determine visible characteristics, they do not predict variation in the rest of the genome. But because they're visible, the visible traits lead to categorization, differential social experience, bias, stereotypes, racism, and discrimination. And racism is the combination of power with racial prejudice, and it can be systemic and it can be institutionalized. And one question we often get when we do these sessions is, what do you mean it's institutionalized? One example of that is access to funding. So this is data from CIHR, Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And when folks apply, they have to say if they self-identify as a visible minority or not. ECR means early career researcher, and oftentimes ECR can be tied to funding or not. If you look at this data, the 2019 funding competition, ECR, early career researcher, wasn't tied with funding success. What was tied with funding success was if someone was not a visible minority or they were, almost a double chance, just above 10% up to just above 20%. So this is an example of structural sustained racism. We can see this in the US as well. This is the racial gap that's seen in success for NIH, National Institutes of Health grants. And again, this is the language in this publication. Folks that self-identify as white versus minority. White identifiers are much more likely to get funded over long term. So we're going to take a look at some evidence of bias across the disciplines and also within healthcare. And the next question is always, well, what do you do about it? And this false dichotomy presents itself where folks will say, we need to focus on structural problems because individuals can't change outcomes when the system is flawed. And that's an argument for focusing on policies and practices. Whereas others will say, we need to focus on people and individuals because structural changes won't have an effect if individuals act on their biases. And we really need both of these things, and education and awareness is what connects them. So it's not an either or discussion. What are some examples of structural changes that have worked? What can we do? So this is one example from the U of T. So Dr. Chika Stacy Oriua was the only Black medical graduate in the year 2016. The next year, they launched the Black Student Application Program. And then in 2020, 24 Black students were accepted to the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine class. They're graduating this spring in 2024, and it's the largest cohort of Black medical students in Canadian history. Similar programs have been adopted elsewhere and dedicated mentorship programs at the University of Ottawa. So this was a very specific structural change that led to a difference in representation. So what we're going to do is look at some selected case studies of bias across the disciplines. What do they tell us? And what could we apply to patient experience and physician experience? So I invite you to come to the chat if you're online. Type in your answer, but we're all going to hit enter at the same time. So can you tell me, what is the average height of an American man? So put your answer in. Then we'll all hit enter at the same time. Go ahead and hit enter. So we have 5'10", 5'8", 6 feet, 5'9". Everyone's going, no one's going with metric. Oh, there we go. 1 centimeter, 170 centimeters. Yeah, so the average height of an American man is 5'9". Okay, so now jump back to the chat. What do you think is the average height of a Fortune 500 CEO? Go ahead and hit enter at any time. The average height of a Fortune 500 CEO, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's 6 feet. Is there something about being taller that makes you a better leader? Or is it about folks' impressions of leadership, folks' impressions of trust and reliability? We know that men who are taller get rated higher on leadership surveys. We know that men who are taller, when they apply for a position, they get a higher starting salary. That height bias does not transfer to women. Women who are taller do not get offered a higher starting salary. But our society values height and ties it to leadership, although it might not actually show who indeed will be a better leader. An interesting comment in the chat, absolutely, the tallest US presidential candidate usually wins. When we look across disciplines, and this includes medicine, there are a lot of bias studies that have been done on fathers and mothers. In many of these studies, you have identical resumes that are submitted with one tiny change, and you look at the difference between the categories. In this case, there were resumes that were implied to be a non-mother and resumes implied to be a mother because in volunteer work, there was labeled active in school council. So they're not labeled as mother or non-mother, they're implied. But when these resumes are submitted for hire, for job postings, evaluators will rate mothers as less competent, less committed to paid work. Mothers will get called back about half as often. They'll be less likely to be hired, and mothers will be offered a lower starting salary. And this, again, has been seen in the medical context. For fathers, implied father is active in school council on the volunteer section. And you find that fathers are not disadvantaged in the hiring process. They're seen as more committed to paid work, and they are offered higher starting salaries. So this is something that's pervasive across disciplines, even in disciplines that are female dominated. The use of language is something that's really important. I want to show you the impact on a funding competition when one word was changed. So CIHR, this funding competition, there was no gender difference in granting when the primary focus was on the excellence of the research proposal. In 2014 and 2015, they brought in the Foundations Grant. And in that review rubric, they asked people to review the excellence of the researcher. So you see, we're switching from proposal, the research, to the person doing the research. So they had to evaluate the researcher. And through focus on the researcher, they introduced bias. So female applicants were 8%, had an 8% success rate versus 13% for male applicants in 2014, and a similar finding in 2015. And similar findings have been found in other competitions in the EU, Sweden, the Netherlands, when the focus is on the person doing the research rather than the research. So just the shift in that rubric introduced bias into that funding competition. There's a whole body of research on reference letters. And again, this spans the disciplines. How reference letters that are written for men or folks from the dominant group are more likely to have superlatives, talk about agentic traits, those are leadership traits. They have longer letters and they have fewer typos. References that are written for women usually talk about approach, working hard, rather than outcomes. And they include more negative language, doubt raisers, like the word despite. And in recent years, these gender bias scanners or calculators have come up where if you write lots of reference letters, you can copy and paste your reference letter text, and it'll highlight any problematic words that you might be using. So I'm going to read these two sentences out loud. And when these sentences are said to people and folks are asked to hire one of these people, I want you to think about who they would choose. So the first sentence, although problems with permits resulted in relatively few publications, her results are high impact. Versus, he has overcome technical challenges to produce high impact contributions. Which one do you think folks would rate higher? When you ask the general public, they'll go for number 2. And yes, there's different pronouns, her versus he, but also the first sentence has doubt raisers. This word although and relatively few, those are doubt raisers. And just the inclusion of a single doubt raiser will decrease our assessment of excellence. These sentences mean the same thing. High impact contributions, few bumps in the road. They mean the same thing, but we don't interpret them the same because they have doubt raisers. So these doubt raisers, they're much more common in reference letters that are written for women and folks from the non-dominant group. And even just one doubt raiser can decrease assessment of excellence, as I mentioned. So something about all these studies in bias is that sometimes the bias is hidden, especially with respect to opportunity gaps and engagement gaps. This is a really interesting study because it's intersectional. Most studies only look at race or they look at gender, and this one looks at both. So this is an email I get really frequently, an email like this, which says, I'm going to be nearby. I'm interested in doing a PhD. Could I meet with you? So these researchers sent this email to over 6,000 professors in the United States, and they just signed different names. They didn't label race or gender. They implied it based on the names they signed. So Brad and Claire implied white, Lamar Keisha, Black, Carlos Juanita, Hispanic, Dong Mei, Chinese, Deepak Indira, South Asian. And what they did is they looked at, did that student get a reply? Not even if it was positive or negative, did they get a reply? And this is a bias of engagement and a bias of opportunity that's often not measured. So they sent this out to more than 6,000 professors across the disciplines. All of the disciplines were more likely to reply to Brad than anyone else, except for one discipline. Can you type in the chat? Can you predict which is the one discipline that was less likely to reply to Brad? You just go ahead and hit enter at any time. So health sciences, which included medicine, was more likely to reply to Brad. Gender studies was lumped into humanities. Humanities was more likely to reply to Brad. Nursing wasn't included. Yeah. And so they're actually looking at why this gap exists. But this is the discriminatory gap. So it was fine arts. It was fine arts that was less likely to reply to Brad. But across all the other disciplines, Brad was much more likely to get a reply. And this is a gap of opportunity that's usually hidden. So in business, he had a 20% discriminatory gap, and that was over everyone else. Okay. Education, health sciences, which included medicine, natural physical sciences, and then even humanities was plus 1% for Brad. And so it's important to recognize that these biases are cumulative, and many of them are hidden. So we could spend a whole full day workshop about bias in the context of patient care, but there's a few things I thought I wanted to put on your radar. One is with clinical trial design. So historically, clinical trials were done on men. You can think of the Harvard study in the early 80s that was looking at aspirin in terms of prevention of heart attacks. There were no women enrolled. Aspirin was prescribed widely to men and women, and it doesn't actually work as well in women, and it's more likely to cause some GI issues. So in clinical trial design, in both mice and humans, more likely to have men, and then women were treated as small men. So adjust the dosage based on weight. Women treated as small men, but women are not small men. There are differences with respect to metabolism, body fat percentage, kidney, liver function, hormones. But there's some really interesting case studies of a clinical trial design and impact. There's a whole body of research about post-heart attack care, coronary heart disease, and bias within. There's research on different outcomes for specific surgeries that you can look at. There's a really interesting case study in the UK where men and women were being discharged from hospital after the same procedure, and they thought they had an equal chance of recovery upon discharge, but they found that after discharge, the women didn't recover as well as they should have, and the men got better. And they were looking at, were there any changes in the hospital? Why was this? And then eventually they figured out it was because the men were going home and being cared for, and the women were going home into caregiving roles. And it was post-discharge care that was the difference. There's a whole body of research with respect to pain management. It's been known for quite a while that when men and women show up at the ER, men receive more pain management and receive it sooner than women. And it was thought, oh, this is a post-puberty thing. This only happens to adults. But now we know that when boys and girls show up in need of appendectomies, the boys receive more pain management and they receive it sooner than girls do. So it's something that starts very young. There's another whole body of research that looks at FaceTime with physicians and what influences that FaceTime. And what we know is that some of these biases that exist with women receiving less FaceTime with physicians, they become accentuated as women age. So when you look at elder care and dementia care, they become accentuated. So we are primed to make certain decisions. We make these split-second decisions, and we are primed by society, by our prior experiences. And I want to walk you through one example. So did you know that if a man collapses in public, he is more likely to receive CPR than if a woman collapses in public? And they have done studies where it'll be an actor who will collapse, and they will monitor who goes and helps them and who gives them assistance. And then they'll ask bystanders, why did you help or why did you not help? What do you think people say when they are asked, why didn't you go to help that woman? Why did they hesitate? What reason do they give? Just go ahead and enter into the chat. And if you don't know, just type, I don't know. Why do you think they would hesitate to help a woman who had collapsed? Yeah, Colleen, absolutely. Fear of sexual harassment. I don't know where to place my hands. So oftentimes the response is something related to breasts. I don't know where to place my hands. I don't want to be accused of inappropriate touching. And there were these CPR dummies that now have detachable breasts so that you can attach them and you can practice where to place your hands. And initially this was dismissed as these detachable breasts will fix this hesitation. But then through studies, they see it actually doesn't fix the hesitation. And some of you have alluded to this in the chat about assuming the woman has fainted. So now think of every movie or TV show you've seen. Think of media you've been exposed to. A man collapses on screen. Why did he collapse? Just go ahead and type it into the chat. Why did the man collapse on screen? Think of movies, TV shows. Why did he collapse on screen? Yeah, MI, heart attack, maybe violence. He was punched, he was shot, he had a stroke. It's usually very serious. So now think of any time a woman has collapsed on screen. TV, movies. Why did the woman collapse on screen? Absolutely, she fainted. She's emotional. She's pregnant. She didn't eat. And there was a whole bunch of, we've actually looked at incidents of female collapse on screen. Paige says she fell because she can't run on high heels. Yes. Why did females collapse on screen? And there was a huge spike in collapse because they didn't eat. They need some sugar. They need some food. There was a huge spike of that in the 90s and the early 2000s. So we are conditioned through media and other aspects of society to interpret a female collapse as less serious than a male collapse. And this bears out when you look at the data of collapsing on screen, men and women, and the reason for that. We're conditioned to interpret it as less serious. We're also primed by the images we see. So the image on your screen, this is from Google Images, and you have a woman giving CPR to a man. It's very, very hard to find an image of a man giving CPR to a man or a man giving CPR to a woman. Part of that is because of the gendered role of nurse in our society. But these images then further perpetuate that priming of the female giving care and male receiving care. So we have to be very careful about the images that we're using. So we have these assumptions, these false beliefs. So we just talked about that false belief of the female collapse is less serious. We have these false beliefs, and those false beliefs will impact our behavior and our decisions. This is an article that was published in PNAS, and it was looking at medical students in the US and false beliefs they hold about race and medicine. And so you don't need to read all of these, but I've highlighted a couple. And again, the language you see here is language from the paper. So the statement of Black people age more slowly than white people. So 21% of first-year medical students thought this was probably true. 14% of residents did. Black people's blood coagulates more quickly than white people's blood. A third of first-year students thought it was true, but then 4% of residents. And Black people's skin is thicker than white people's skin. So 40% of first-year students and 25% of residents. So they surveyed medical students and residents to get an idea of beliefs in these mistaken facts. And about 50% of medical students thought at least one false statement was possibly, probably, or definitely true. And then they read through case studies and prescribed pain regimens, management regimens. So an increased endorsement of false statements resulted in a decreased pain rating for Black patients, and that had prescription effects directly. So this is what one of the graphs you see here that just shows that increased belief in untrue biological differences between Black and white people correlates with a decreased accuracy of treatment recommendation for pain in Black patients. And again, you can see this across for gender. Within Canada, there's been some really important and thoughtful work done on Indigenous people and their experiences at the ER with respect to pain medication. But we need to be aware of how beliefs we have, whether correct or incorrect, will influence accuracy of treatment recommendation. So you go back to this landscape of bias that we're looking at, and there's so many examples of bias, differential treatment, and serious impacts. What can we do about that when society is priming us to act in a certain way? And so what are some of the evidence-informed practices that we could adopt? So when we look at recommended practices for change, it is really helpful to think of what are evidence-informed structural practices and what are evidence-informed personal practices, because otherwise it can be overwhelming. So these are just some of the ones that we're looking at. So on the structural side, having diverse teams and review boards will impact differential treatment. Having diversity targets and monitoring and incentives will help with representation. It's really important that there are transparent decision-making processes. We'll talk about that in a second. And specific pathways to recruitment, retention, and leadership. These all go towards representation and who's in the space. On the personal side, again, unconscious bias training doesn't work. We can't train these out of us, but we can increase our awareness. Awareness training does work to recognize and interrupt signs of bias, specific training on allyship and self-reflective practice. Language use is really important. The words that we use, they can prime folks to act in a certain way, and to recognize and name specific tropes that are prevalent can be really important. This is continual. It's not just a one-step thing. And at the center of this that connects these is education and awareness, which is what we're talking about today. So I wanted to show you a success story for implementing some of those structural changes. So this is the Swedish Medical Research Council. In 1995, these were their grant applications. They calculated this gender blind total impact on the bottom here. And if reviewers weren't considering gender, the line should be the same. But instead, men are getting a bump for being men. So reviewers could not consider scientific merit without considering gender. And more men were receiving funding from the Medical Research Council. So the institutional responses was to monitor equity of outcomes, compare to targets, have diverse committees that are educated about bias, have a rubric, and engage in blind review. And in just 11 years, they were able to remove this bias, which 11 years is very quick in the context of sustained change for inclusive practices. So some things for you to be aware of for interrupting bias and ideas for change. It's really important. I thought we'd just choose 5 things that you could take away into your workplace practice. It's really important that you eliminate personal/identity-based information when assessing performance. So incorporate more than one independent assessment. Ensure you're using gender-neutral language whenever possible. So for example, this student. So in a reference letter you write, if you don't say she or her and you say this student's work rather than her work, it can increase the assessment of excellence. So gender-neutral language. There's a whole body of literature on time and how we use our time. Across the board, we know that rushing will lead to a stronger effect of biases. So Bertrand and Beatty's article in 2013 showed that when we rush, our biases take over. And so if you can add more time for careful assessment, that'll decrease the bias inherent. It's really important to have specific rubrics and relate assessment and judgments to that. So we do a whole bunch of work on hiring committees and help training with those committees for inclusive practices. And there's certain words that you should not use, like the word fit. I don't know if that is one you hear often. I want a good fit. And that's fine. You might want a good fit in a hire, but you need to define that, because if you don't define fit, it can just end up meaning not him or not her. So again, justifications and judgments, make sure they're evidence-based, they're recorded in specific notes. If you don't know what to write down to record in a specific note, it might mean it's not evidence-based or it's not based on a thing. And a specific item, it could again go back to fit. And reflecting on assumptions about students, patients, etc., how they may affect your responses. So inferences about motive, intent, personality, emotions, these can affect nonverbal cues and biases. There's a whole body of literature on this where women are expected to smile more. And so if a woman doesn't smile as much, then she'll get a negative penalty, a personality penalty on that. Some of these inferences can be really gendered and racialized. There's a Halberstadt study, 2018, where anger is incorrectly inferred in neutral faces of Black people. We should be really careful about these inferences that we're making and what they're based on. Okay. And so that was just sort of a an overview of this TIDE work that we're engaged in, and then also this project of the landscape of bias in medicine. I'm happy to send you slides. And when this is published, there will be several modules and open educational resources for folks to use. And I'm happy to send you the links once it's done.
Thank you, Dr. Roll. What an eye-opening presentation. That was really amazing. So if it's okay, I'm just gonna kick it off and ask you, in our department, there have been a couple of issues that have arisen that I wondered if I could just get your reflections on. So the first one is you likely know that CIHR is actually addressing some of the structural issues that you've talked about. So for example, for upcoming CRC chairs, there is a very specific recommendation about these being targeted to, and it's worded very carefully. It doesn't say women. It says, I can't remember the exact nomenclature. Nish can type it into the chat if she can. But there's been a lot of reaction, I would say, with this, and this whole argument around affirmative action and ensuring that there is an equal place for excellence and all of that. Now, that study you put up there with the type of research as opposed to the researcher was very telling in terms of negating some of that bias. But I wonder if you could comment on those types of structural actions, I guess, if you will. And then the second question, if it's okay, I was going to ask you is the other side of it, where we've also had a little bit of, I guess, reaction and difficulties in some of our teaching environments, where some real gender differences that have been highlighted in lectures and so on. So for example, higher risk of cardiac issues in Asian males as opposed to other racial ethnicities has been met with difficult conversations. And so just those two extremes, and I'd really appreciate your comments on those.
Yeah, absolutely. So the discussion around, quote, affirmative action programs or programs that are specifically targeted to specific groups in terms of opportunity, representation, and funding, those are incredibly important for achieving structural change with respect to representation. If you don't have targeted programs with mandates in terms of numbers, we won't achieve representation, equitable representation. So they're incredibly important. The dialogue around it can be really fraught in terms of views of taking opportunities away from one group versus another. How do you equitably assign opportunities? So we have to start with representation. When you look at the scissor graph, like time won't change anything. So that's when, we have parity in terms of PhD graduates, but then they don't reach full professor. It's not just a leaky pipeline. There's other systemic changes. So that's one thing to do. Oftentimes in these discussions, we look at how these changes affect everyone and benefit everyone. They're not just benefiting this one group that's getting access, but I understand how the discussions around it can be really fraught. With respect to specific groups in terms of disease characteristics and risk, sometimes we go back. So I teach this when I teach molecular basis of disease. We go back to there's a genetic risk for everything, and there's different SNPs, polymorphisms we can look at. Sometimes they're tied to families, sometimes they're tied to racial background, but they're not necessarily indicative of behavior. So one we look at is we look at lung cancer prediction with different mutations. Black men are much more likely to have some of these mutations. How do you frame that in terms of screening? Sometimes these mutations mean that smoking will increase the risk dramatically. How do you frame that in terms of behavior in a way that isn't associated with shame? So I think going back to this understanding of genetic diversity and variation, The vast majority of variation is within groups, not between groups. But having said that, there are specific polymorphisms that indicate risk. So we talk about it the same in terms of how we talk about like BRCA1, BRCA2 with breast cancer. We separate out the polymorphisms from race because they often are not the same. Yeah, I'm not sure if
The
that's
language
helpful.
is so important.
Yeah.
So there are some questions online, so I'll start with those. The first one is around institutional racism. Why are there programs to support Black students? And why, if we speak about racial discrepancies, data that Asians are usually the most successful racial group is often not presented?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the data we have is that in terms of targeted support, it's really important to be specific. It's important to have targeted support that's specific for a specific group and how that group will be supported, but then that needs to branch out to be more inclusive. So when you look at structural change over time, it's really important that it's targeted. I know a lot of the discussion about Asian representation with the lawsuit with Harvard recently, et cetera, in the States. There's been more of that discussion in the States than in Canada. We do look at that. There is a whole bunch of studies with respect to racial diversity and bias and what gets funding and what doesn't. That's part of the landscape study in terms of how we frame it, who is included and who is excluded. So all I can say about that is that with respect to sustained change, it's important that it's targeted at the start. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to branch out to be inclusive. So we can see this with women in science initiatives. So in the 90s and the early 2000s, there were lots of women in science initiatives, and they benefited white women. There's a whole bunch of data on this, that they weren't inclusive. They weren't specifically targeted for specific groups and representation.
Thank you. Next one is, why in the study that analyzed which candidate is more likely to get response, there were only fine arts presented, but not
Yeah, that study that went to 6,000 US professors. Yeah, so those are the initial 10 divisions, and there's some follow-up studies that are looking specifically at female-dominated spheres and seeing how that impacts. So if Brad applies or Claire applies, which are very common names in US bias research, and they code white male, white female, looking at that. So there are follow-up studies on that are ongoing. Yeah, but that is a gap because it would be really interesting to see in specific nursing, what are the outcomes of that?
Thank you. Can you comment on diversity of disability within medicine, a group that has been actively discriminated against with technical standards that are out of date and extreme ableism within medicine and academia? How do we overcome the bias against people with disability within medicine?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So we know there's also a funding gap. When you look at projects that look at bias and research, gender bias, racial bias gets the most support. There's some with respect to sexuality bias and disability bias. There's a huge funding gap. So when we put together these resources and these workshops, sometimes we actually have trouble finding data on disability bias and especially data on evidence-informed practices that have been funded to work. So we know with respect to disability bias, a lot of it comes down to misinformation and pervasive stigma attached to that misinformation about ability. And so there's some work we're doing looking at autism labels and neurodivergent groups. There's some work we're doing with respect to physical ability and disability. So I can say that the lack that you see, the gap that you see, starts early with respect to funding. There's a funding gap on that.
Thank you. If we assume that equal gender representation is good, why Scandinavian countries that provide equality of opportunity have one of the highest gender discrepancies across multiple spheres?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
So representation is the first step and not the last step. So we know that representation alone will not lead to whole-scale inclusive practices. You need representation to get there, but it's not the last step. And so this is some of the problems of the initiatives that started in the 90s and the 2000s with women in STEM. Representation and being in the room is not enough. So some of it comes down to inclusion, belonging, a seat at the table, and co-creating the table. Some cultures, like you're mentioning some Scandinavian cultures, we see this in Switzerland, which is not Scandinavian, but it's very patriarchal. Switzerland only recently got paid maternity leave, which most people are not aware of. So representation is not the only item. It's not the end point. It's just the first starting point.
And then the next one is around the CIHR study that you put up. If gender ethnicity was blinded for CIHR looking at excellence of researchers, would it not be fair to look at past publications and funding granted?
Great question.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the blinding doesn't always resolve everything because reference letters are written in a certain way. There was an interesting study by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation where men were more likely to get funded. And so they blinded all of the applications, sent them to reviewers, and still men were more likely to get funded by women. And when they looked at it, it was because in the male applications from men, they were more likely to have huge words and talking about impact and broad scale change, and the women's applications were much more specific. If the expert reviewing the package was not an expert in that field, they would rate the men higher. If the expert was from the same field, they would rate them the same. And so some of these things that are ingrained with respect to behavioral change and words that we use, just blinding won't get rid of it. Blinding also doesn't get rid of sort of the prior opportunity gap. So that's something to be aware of. It's a little bit of a red or a pink flag, maybe not a red flag, but blinding isn't the cure-all.
I like that phrase, prior opportunity gap, because I think we forget about that. Yeah. Okay, next one is, it's interesting to reflect on the processes entailed in health science research grant and publication submission review processes compared with, for example, fine art competitions. The former is generally not anonymously structured for reviewers, but the latter often is. Can you comment on the status in Canada and elsewhere about increasing processes for anonymizing authors for science grant and manuscript reviews, which you just talked about? Is there evidence that this makes a difference?
Yeah, and so when I say that blinding isn't, sorry, and I should say the word anonymization rather than blinding. Sorry about that. Anonymization doesn't cure everything, but it can help with that first step, right? But we have to recognize that there are also all these other things that contribute to it. So there's quite a few funding competitions now that do go through an anonymization process. And sometimes you see the double blind process with reviewers. Yeah.
So this is a really good question, and something that many of us in leadership positions face is how do we counteract the perception that individuals are so-called EDI hires and somehow unqualified, and we're only hired because of the need for representation, if you will. And this does sometimes lead to hesitancy in people applying for these positions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So something with this label, I would not call it EDI-based hiring. I would call it asset-based hiring. These folks who are hired from different backgrounds, different experiences, they bring very different skills. They don't just bring representation in terms of diversity and who's in the room. They bring very different skills. So I think we need to really reframe it as asset-based hiring. They are bringing skills that other folks can't bring because they don't have that lived experience. And so that's one thing is we're really trying to get out of using that phrase of EDI-based hire or an EDI hire. Yeah, but I absolutely agree. There's a perception throughout the academy that sees that hire as lesser, and it's not accurate. And I think it's because it's not connected to asset-based hiring.
That's so helpful. Some of the language that you're using. I mean, I think we've recorded this, so I'm going to go back and take some of those phrases that you've helped us with. Thank you for an incredibly thoughtful presentation. I wonder, beyond the best practices that you mentioned for those in positions of power to address and mitigate bias, what are some best practices for individuals who experience bias to push back against such power dynamics in a generative way?
That's a great question. So, and you've used a really important word there, which is power. So there's a lot of data on power dynamics and the power folks hold to enact change in these situations. So data around microaggressions, if a microaggression happens, for example, with a trainee and a patient, and there's a supervisor in the space and the supervisor doesn't do anything about it, if someone in a position of power doesn't act, it can see as a reinforcement of the bias or a reinforcement of that microaggression. And so some of the data that we've looked at has really looked at networks and mentorship, especially for folks that are maybe not in a position of power. The need to have a network, the need to have mentors of different identities that can help navigate that is what we point to. Another thing is the language that's used, assuming good intent in terms of corrections and this idea of gentle nudges. So adopting a workplace practice of gentle nudges, saying, oh, hey, I don't think this is what you meant, but this is how it could be interpreted, can be really important. So assuming good intent and this idea of gentle nudges can actually go a long way. And there's a fair bit of data on that.
Gentle nudges. Okay. So this is an interesting question about the whole sort of language and what's used. A vast majority of Indians do not refer to themselves when in their own communities as South Asian. Yet this is the term that's applied by others in the Western world. And these very Indians feel compelled to adopt this term not native to their own communities. So, for example, Russians are never asked to refer to themselves as North Asian. How can diversity be done correctly? Bias is a very important topic. Thank you.
That's so important. Yeah, the labels and who gets to determine the labels are those in positions of power and positions of leadership. So some of the work that's been done on that, a lot of what I'm aware of is with respect to sexuality and different folks, how they would want to be referred to. There are some groups some evidence from different racial groups. Change has happened when folks from those groups have representation in leadership and then are changing the way rubrics are assigned, the way patient descriptors are assigned. So we have seen change as folks are in positions of leadership who come from those groups. But I agree, it's really problematic because the labels are decided by the folks who have previously been in power. And there's this wonderful paper about the COIN model of allyship in healthcare. I'm not sure if you've seen this. I'm happy to send it in the notes, but it's really about the language and the labels we use for different folks in society, including patients, and the different barriers they face. And it's about who decides those labels. It's a really great paper. I'll put it in the notes.
I know we don't have very much time, so I'm just going to pick out a couple of questions that seem to be common themes. So there's a question around some of the removal of EDI offices and areas being shut down in various places from post-secondary to governments. Do you have any thoughts about that? Particularly in the US, I think.
It's really misunderstood and really problematic. And I think we should not assume that it won't happen here, because a lot of the dialogue that was happening in the US 4 years ago that preceded that is now happening in the Canadian context. There was this great podcast a few years ago about Canada not being immune from things that were happening in the US around EDI and bias. I'm happy to put that in the notes as well. So I think we have to be aware that it could happen here. And I think some of that strife is related to the language we're using, like EDI hire versus asset-based hire. This idea that EDI work is going to take away from another group. This idea that EDI work is about blaming another group or forcing some group to take responsibility when that is not the motivation at all. So some of the language change could be linked to that and decreasing tensions with that. But yeah, it's incredibly problematic and concerning.
Yeah, it's really about growth and learning, right? None of us are perfect by any means. Yeah. There are a lot more questions, which I think basically highlight how important and amazing this talk was.
I just want to ask one of the other questions out there.
Oh, okay. And there's one more that my associate chair wants to ask. Here.
So I wanted to address the question on ableism and the technical standards, because this is literally something we're talking at a national level in medical schools. So there are actually brand new technical standards that are addressing this issue, and we're having discussions of what do you really need to graduate medical school? Because this old thought of, well, you might be a surgeon who needs to be able to do all this stuff all the way to other specialties. So I just want to add that comment to that question. It's a great question. We are right now in the midst of the MD program locally trying to figure out, so what is actually needed? because we need to be able to be more inclusive. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thanks, PJ.
Thank you. Dr. Rawls, on behalf of the department, thank you for such provocative and educational and really helpful presentation this morning, and for addressing all our many questions and many more to come. We'll send you these and see if we can get some kind of response if you have time. So
Thank
on
you. The
behalf of
questions
the
were
department, thank you.
incredibly thoughtful. Thank you so much.
Okay, take care. Have a great weekend, everybody.